What do CDs, slinkies, holiday lights, peanut butter, and PVC piping have to do with each other? They are a few of the tools of our trade as municipal wildlife managers, tools that can aid us in positive and successful communication with our residents and patrons. I'm Barbara Ray, a nature education coordinator and wildlife resource contact for the City of Dublin. In this session, we will take a look at some key communication skills, tips and tricks that make our jobs easier in meeting the requests and needs of our community regarding wildlife questions and wildlife conflicts. We want to leave people feeling good about their interaction with us and help them to understand wildlife better. Communication is best defined as action to create understanding. That's actually really worth repeating. Action to create understanding. We think of this through our language and writing or talking to others, but much communication is also our demeanor, our tone, how we present ourselves, and of course, the nonverbal language when we're visible to others, whether in person or nowadays, for safety, more through virtual meeting. Communication as a public servant is our livelihood. This is one of our most important skills, both with our community and with our coworkers. Whether we have all the answers or not to a given situation, we can leave our communiques feeling positive when we're patient, respectful, showing empathy, and just treating each other with kindness. Even in those cases where others are certainly provoking or engendering anything but kindness, we still can communicate fairly and kindly, and actually it's our duty in public service. Communication is creating understanding. It is our goal to find ways to help another person or group leave with a clear answer or a clear goal and ways to reach it or to find the resources they need. In this session, we're going to focus primarily on verbal communication, the direct interactions we have with our community in the field, and taking phone calls or replying to email service inquiries and requests about wildlife. An important aspect of communication is certainly our web pages and social media sites and even local publications. But as these modes of communication are often managed under the public information offices, our focus will be on our direct communication with people. People want the tiger, and we have only kittens. Depending on the flood of inquiries and requests and the people making them on any given day, it's easy to kind of blame the person for what is happening or failure to solve an issue or impractical, maybe a lack of common sense, where folks want us to help or do something for them. Sometimes calls come in from a person who has spoken to other people prior, and they may tell me those people wouldn't help them, or they were mean about it, or the person told me, quote, I really harmed that baby bird that fell out of the tree by trying to feed it milk, and so it might die now. While those things may be true, and some of the things that people come up with leave us scratching our heads, people do the best they can with the knowledge they have or lack thereof. So even on our hardest days, it pays to use good interpretive technique to turn difficult situations and distress residents into more positive professional interactions. Even when it's hard, or maybe we even have to fake it a little bit. Certainly, baby birds don't drink milk, but occasionally people do that. There is often a difference in what a caller or contact thinks they want to know and what we want them to know, or what we need to share with them if we're actually going to help them solve their problem or answer their question. We've all had a call from a resident asking us to come and, quote, rescue the fawn that's curled up on their front step, and it must be sick or injured because it just lies there and it can't get up when they approach it. The resident wants a rescue, that's why they called, when in fact what they really need is to know that this is normal behavior for fawns first 2 weeks of their life. People want to know what to do. In this case, nothing, except observe from a distance, ignore the fawn, and be aware that the doe may be nearby and she could act protectively. So dogs should be kept away from the area, and overnight, of course, the doe might move the fawn. When people make an inquiry, they really want to be heard. We need to listen and acknowledge their fears or their eagerness to get something done. Sometimes just showing empathy. Oh, I understand why it may look like that fawn is injured since it's just lying there, and it won't stand. That might be all the person needs to know that we've heard them. Some issues are best handled by the city, and communication can be successfully resolved by giving the person a brief rundown of what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. Good communication comes with core competencies, skills that we should all be able to demonstrate in jobs requiring interface with the public and in situations that the public sees oftentimes as emergencies or critical situations, things that should be dealt with right now, which includes even dead animals on the road. People call and want those picked up right away. So our ability to solve wildlife conflicts using sound biology and sometimes creative solutions in a positive manner are really important competencies. Maintaining composure when sometimes the resident is not. Occasionally residents are hysterical, and usually it's a situation involving an injured animal. And we need to keep a positive attitude. That's also important. Residents can be abrasive, they can be downright argumentative or harsh, and that can be a little bit challenging to stay positive sometimes with those people. We have all likely had the call where a parent is upset because they saw a coyote trotting past the corner where their kids usually stand for the bus stop. They're so distressed they may even call other residents and get the whole block protesting and contacting us. They don't really want to hear that the coyote is behaving normally and not a threat. And then we'll give them some things they can teach their children if they ever do see a coyote that doesn't run off as soon as it sees them. And we'll refer people to a training video on our website that teaches a coyote smart response. We can use good interpretive technique as well. The field of wildlife interpretation, if you think of naturalists, zoo and park guides, and educators as an example, is a communication process that relates a topic or place or thing to its audience, provokes thought, emotion, and even action, and in our realm, as wildlife managers, can also empower residents to solve a wildlife conflict, or maybe it's something as simple as helping a student who inquired about urban skunks for a school report. A lot of the basic biology about animals is easier for people to understand when we relate it to things they're already familiar with. A myth that the rabbits will abandon their bunnies if kids touch them can be busted when we frame it as, well, if you were lost in a store and a security guard walks up to you and taps you on the shoulder and asks you if you need help, is your mother really going to abandon you? Of course not. And of course, mother animals are tightly bonded to their animals. A good example is a raccoon call I had where a resident was really nervous. I could tell on the phone she was kind of shaking, and she was frightened to go on her back patio because a big raccoon kept coming up by the back door, the sliding door, and every time she went near the door, the raccoon would growl and hiss. And she thought it was probably sleeping during the day underneath the furniture cover. So I visited the residence and I gently lifted up part of the cover, and the mama kind of growled and ran out and up over the patio fence, and 4 little kits stared at me and hunkered down on the chairs. I was able to pull the cover all the way off, and the kits scattered, kind of running into the corners of the enclosed patio. Mom was just kind of watching me up from top of the fence. So she came back a little bit warily, climbed down, scruffed the first kit, and climbed out, walked down the sidewalk with her baby right into the nearby woods, apparently taking them to an alternate den. She did this 4 times to retrieve all 4 of the kits. I suggested to the resident to leave the furniture uncovered for at least a week or 2, and that way the mom would not return. The resident actually became interested in being able to watch them through the window and realized that the raccoons weren't trying to attack me, even though I was totally in their space. And she understood then that they're more afraid of us than we are of them. I did inform her that she made a good choice to stay inside, as certainly raccoons are not opposed to charging to defend or when they're cornered, such as in this small enclosed patio. Some of us are more direct and blunt by nature in our interactions with our family and friends, and to some extent, maybe even our coworkers. And we certainly want to be honest and direct with our public, but we also need to do so tactfully. We can get a lot of public cooperation even in unpleasant circumstances or in cases where the residents believe that the city should do something and we have to explain that that's just not going to happen. But by just treating each person respectfully. Use a little more moxie with people. People may be coming across negative or argumentative, but what they really want is leadership. And providing answers or ideas to wildlife issues in a savvy, firm manner can put people at ease. If they can tell that we know what we're talking about and are trying to help them, we can keep them calm. Often we can sound a lot smarter than we are about a situation just by our positive, confident delivery style. This comes in handy when we offer a resident several ideas of how to solve a conflict. We don't know for sure that if we recommend they haze that woodchuck with the water bottle burrow method that it's going to work on that woodchuck. So we offer a couple different ideas. The resident has options of something to do. And it kind of makes us look good. Obviously, if we don't know something, we can tell people we just don't know and we'll find out. But they want to feel like we're the professionals. So let's look at some common scenarios that cause residents to give us a call with urgency about their situation. Calls about leg injured deer are pretty common and they're actually really distressful for the caller. People put themselves in the animal's shoes and they imagine its pain and suffering and they want us to help the deer. You know, if we had a broken limb or a leg dangling, we're going to be in the hospital, probably in a lot of pain and surgery. And so they really don't understand that nature has a different way of dealing with this. And of course, deer would flip their lids if they were held captive for rehabilitation and likely die of stress or capture myopathies down the road. So that's not an option. Sometimes we have to explain that to people. We have to explain some of the other ways nature accommodates wildlife injuries with natural painkillers such as endorphins and corticosteroids, and the rete mirabile, or wonderful net, which is that vascular network that controls the flow of blood to the lower limbs. So in the wintertime, that's a cool thing for birds and deer and cows and horses. Their limbs stay about 38 or 40 degrees, just a little bit warmer than the environment. So they don't really get frostbite feeling to their limbs like we do. Because the blood is shunted and the cold blood coming back up the leg goes through this network to warm back up so they don't lose body temperature. But in the case of a broken limb, if it's not healing, that network of blood vessels will just shut the blood flow off to the limb. So they're not really probably at that point feeling anything. The limb dies and generally will fall off. Usually if the limbs are dangling, it's because the hide is so tough and thick, it may not break away right away. But again, that's very distressful for people seeing a deer running through their yard with a leg dangling. So this is very shocking and new to most residents, as we can imagine. We then let them know the best thing that they can do to help that deer is observe to see that it's getting around okay and not losing a ton of weight. The photo on the right on this slide shows a deer that's healing after a limb is fairly recently detached. And this guy has obviously lost some weight in the process. Maybe he had an infection, maybe he wasn't able to walk around as well to eat, or maybe both. So he's going to need further observation to see that he's recovering and not failing. None of us want to watch a deer slowly die, and residents are really our best set of eyes to watch how these animals do. Similar with coyote, fox, and other animals who may be injured but are otherwise getting along with their lives despite their compromise. Sometimes the best help is to do nothing and just observe the animal, make sure it's not failing. A couple of years ago, in neighboring Upper Arlington, a fawn became known as Pumpkinhead when he got a discarded plastic trick-or-treat pumpkin caught on his head. He was still probably eating some candy out of there. He was still able to eat and drink and get around fine, but people called and called for weeks. They called ODNR, they called UA, they called Dublin, they called Wildlife Rescue. No stone was unturned of who they called. They probably didn't call the president, but they called everybody else. Why can't you just catch it and take it off? Why not just dart him and remove it? The media picked up the story and the inquiries kept rolling in. And of course, we had to do a lot of education about why these things were not a good idea for this deer. So the plan on the wildlife side of things was to see if the plastic would just break eventually, or he might break it rubbing it. So that's what we were trying to educate people. But the public was mortified about this. They were irate with the Ohio Division of Wildlife. They were name calling anyone who insisted the deer was doing fine, despite the dangers of interfering, and that the toy pumpkin would likely break on its own, which eventually is exactly what happened. But because this took a month or two, the public was totally crazy over this. We already mentioned those fawns in people's yards. And the doe on the right had been struck by a car apparently, and finally got to where she couldn't walk around anymore, and at this time was experiencing hind limb paralysis. This allowed Coyote to begin feeding on her rump while she was still alive and just watching them. This, of course, entirely freaked out the homeowners, and the deer was dispatched and removed, of course. But she really wasn't feeling anything at that point because she didn't have any use of those limbs from mid-spine down. Nature, when it's at work, is really distressing for people. And as much as exposure as kids have these days growing up to reality wildlife shows, and young people in general seem to have a pretty good understanding of basic wildlife biology, no one is prepared to see nature happening in their urban front yard. So our jobs become as much therapist as wildlife manager as we try to calm fears and end suffering of wildlife in distress. We already talked about the fawns that are in people's yards and on their porches, and helping people understand those animals' presence. Some calls are about deer chasing dogs or dog walkers on our park paths or even in their neighborhoods, sometimes even in backyards. We have had a few does overprotective actually go into a backyard and chase down a couple dogs. Usually this is during the fawning season, and we can offer options to people to avoid the area for about 2 weeks until the fawn is old enough to stay with its mom. Sometimes deer are habituated at bird feeders and they can become a little twitchy during the rut. It's not common, but occasionally a buck will go after a person or a dog during that season. Sometimes bird feeding needs to be suspended for a period of time to deter deer or other wildlife. Or I recommend to people just put out enough quality seed that the birds clean it up before midday, and then don't refill it or take the feeder inside. Folks that have been doing that have had really good luck of keeping unwanted wildlife from collecting in their yard. Once in a while, calls come in where people have seen a doe cross their street, but her fawn is on the other side getting pretty stressed. I would say we get 2 to 3 calls every spring about this. Sometimes people are out in our streets crew or somebody sees it and they help it. So there are times when we might advise a person if it seems like they can do it, to just give the fawn a little nudge to pop them in the street. Occasionally, a fawn is actually carried across, but it's all new to them, and they get to the curb, and some of them don't seem to know what to do. So sometimes we might help them in that case. And again, we're probably also then educating that touching the fawn is not going to make the mom abandon it. And of course, anytime we get near a fawn, we got to watch that doe because she may become suddenly protective. Deer collisions are a part of residency in Ohio. I have I've actually only struck 3 or 4 deer, but I've had the rest of them hit my vehicle, kind of darting out and hitting the side. And only a few of those deer actually perished on the road. But all we can do is remind people, I think 45 miles an hour was the fastest I was going in any of those cases. All we can do is remind people to pay attention during deer seasons when they're moving around a lot, spring and now during rut, and to slow down. We kind of sure callers that we're placing deer crossing signs in high volume crossing areas. These are places where we've taken the most deer strike reports or where there's well-known deer crossing paths. Reminding people to pay attention when they see these signs and not ignore them. The rest is in the hands of the drivers. Keeping data is really helpful in communicating about deer numbers in general because residents will call insisting that the city needs to cull deer because there's so many, they're such a danger on the roads. But if we have this deer vehicle strike data, that often belies that perception that the public has. Deer strikes in Dublin have reduced from about 60 reports annually about 10 years ago to less than 20 reports annually in the past few years. And a lot of this is actually really well-placed deer crossing signs and a lot of public education on social media, in HOAs and next door during season to remind people to pay attention. Coyote, of course, are always going to be a hot topic immediately when an incident occurs, sometimes just when they see a coyote. The day that coyote are as mundane to residents as robins and rabbits will be a very happy day. We are making progress getting people to accept coyote presence without total panic. But a swift and immediate response from the city can always thwart a large outcry when an incident happens. We had a dog that was deterrent bitten. That's where a coyote rushes out and nips an offending animal in the rump or ears, and then they quickly retreat, which people call an attack, but really it's not that. It's kind of a nip. Anyway, dog got bitten in one of our parks, and a local news station ran a story that was pretty fear-mongering. So I responded right away and asked them to please stop and report the facts. They called me and asked if we could set up a Facebook Live Q&A, which I did. The reporter was really gracious. They apologized for taking things, really just sounding a bit out of proportion, and they helped us get really good education to the public. The Nextdoor and Facebook and Instagram hullabaloo lasted all of about 1 day, and I really never heard another word about it after that. So we put up temporary snow fencing along a 200-foot section where the coyote were denning. The dog that was bitten was off lead and was routinely running into the private property where the coyote had pups. So of course, eventually the coyote get annoyed and they do something about it. So we left that fencing up until the end of July. And since then, which this was I think in 2018, residents seem to have better knowledge now to behave and to keep their dogs on lead and be aware of the conflict they can create when they don't keep their dogs on lead. Of course, it might not be their dog that gets bitten, but the 10th dog who is on his leash might be the one that gets bitten because the coyotes are annoyed. Woodchucks who invade gardens and dig under foundations, they're not really the sort of gardeners we want or the builders we want. But we can offer a lot of tried and true solutions, including fencing gardens. The gardener in the center photo here even placed a temporary wire skirt around the base so that the woodchuck couldn't come right up to the fence and dig under. Underwiring decks and sheds, and then evicting wildlife from attics and chimneys using one-way doors, and then repairing the entrance. We can provide resources for those who want to DIY and or suggest they hire a contractor if they don't want to do their own work. And we can recommend how they might utilize animal control companies for humane solutions rather than just trap and kill, which actually many residents are opposed to. One-way doors can be homemade, or some owners are really gung-ho to do that. Most prefer a company to do this, or they to come and install it and deal with the animals. Directing the do-it-yourselfers to construction plans can be helpful, and keeping a file of ready-to-send help sheets is really time-saving. And again, even on those help sheets, editing them so they're user-friendly and really easy for the public to utilize. We also need to inform residents about trying to evict animals in the spring and early summer. As a general rule, if you're taking an animal out of an attic or under a porch by March, it's probably guaranteed to be a female with babies or about to have babies. So squirrels, raccoons, bats, we have to take care in how we explain options so they understand there's probably young involved. Some homeowners or property managers insist on trapping, and some call to complain already they've spent thousands of dollars removing umpteen animals. Well, yeah, another will move in when the space opens up. Um, offering permanent solutions may work well in these situations, as by this time the people really don't want to keep paying a trapper, so they're a little bit more open to fixing it permanently. And a lot of homeowners don't know that once an adult is trapped, there may be young left behind. Not all companies will inform owners of this, and then the folks are calling, 3 or 4 days later, hey, I hear babies screaming in the walls, they need rescued. In Ohio, nuisance wildlife progeny cannot be rehabilitated. It either needs to be reunited with its mom or euthanized if it's removed from the den. Residents get really upset about this, but of course the root of the problem is messing with a mom in the first place, and the company not informing the owner. The trapper should be responsible for the progeny, as the babies are really an extension of the mom. Sometimes people want to relocate, but laws restrict that for many, not all, but many species. So raccoon, skunk, opossum, woodchuck, beaver, those are animals that really by law can't be relocated. And most animals fail within months of relocation, obviously due to conflicts with other wildlife over food and territories. Again, this is a good place for interpretive technique to help us. And sometimes I'll tell a person, imagine someone putting you on a plane, dropping you out onto the desert of a foreign land. You have no idea where to find food and water, where you can make a home. And if the current residents see you as an invader, this is not going to end well for you. People can then kind of relate to how this scenario might play out for some poor animal that's just being dumped somewhere. Having good instincts and will to survive is not enough. The animal has to have resources that aren't already spoken for, and that's not very likely being put in another place that's already inhabited. The battle of the bottles is a lot of times woodchucks and burrowing animals can be sorted out of a den with these plastic water bottles. So you take the cheapest, crinkliest bottles, put 2 or 3 inches of water in and cap it, and you put them in the entrance of the burrow. So if it's a large opening, it may take several bottles. If it's a smaller opening, it might just take 3 or 4. So these animals, when they come up to dig these out of the way or even dig the dirt around it, these things move, they make noise, and it's very frightening to them. We've had a lot of success with people getting woodchucks out from under their house or deck using these water bottles. Who knew, right? And I kind of discovered it accidentally, trying to get some woodchucks out of a burrow in a horse pasture, try to prevent our horses from getting their legs broken. For skunks, I usually only recommend using 1 or 2 bottles to partially block the entrance because you really don't want to spook a skunk right away because they may spray. So 1 bottle will give them an idea something's going on there, but they can investigate it and then decide to leave because it's not normal, rather than spooking them quickly. Wildlife garden damage, obviously we have lots of tools we can recommend to people. Some are better than others. Obviously fencing only works if it's species appropriate, and deer fencing can get pretty involved. Electricity is very effective if it's installed right. So we have to explain how these different methods might work so that a gardener can kind of decide. But again, we're giving people something they can do to solve or reduce damage. Epsom salts, by the way, work in some cases, sprinkling it on plants, and animals don't like the taste of it. So electric fencing is pretty effective for smaller mammals to keep them climbing a garden fence. It has to be installed at least 1 strand, maybe 5 or 6 inches off the ground, and another strand taking into account that the animal might stand on its hind legs and reach up to grab the fence. So a couple strands are going to be pretty effective against a lot of little mammals. Then for deer, a staggered fencing method works pretty well. A lot of times they can't quite understand how to get through it, around it, or over it, so it can be very effective. The peanut butter deer fence can be installed as just really 1 strand of electric wire on insulator post with aluminum foil tabs secured with some tape, and then they're smeared with a dab of peanut butter. Setting up that type of a fence can actually be an entire family activity. Making and taping the tabs up every 6 or 8 feet is pretty simple, and even young kids could help do that. And certainly smearing the peanut butter on the tabs is pretty easy. If the fence is going to be in a yard used by pets, it's obviously best to remind people to turn it off when the pets are out, or set it up high enough that a pet won't run into it. These are some simple things that a gardener might not think of, but we can share with them good practices and caveats with any method. We also want to make sure, obviously, we're recommending things that are safe for a particular person in a particular situation. The presence of dogs are a great deterrent. Our house will tree a raccoon if it comes around the barn or the house. And we don't have very many feral cats hanging out for more than a half a day. Once treed, I think it's a type of hazing, they tend not to come back, although our dogs don't chase our house cats indoors. They also don't bother skunks, so I've only had to bathe 3 or 4 times in the past 20 years, I think. But even a pet dog that has no interest in wildlife is sometimes a good deterrent for a lot of wildlife. People do need to know, obviously, that a coyote may see a dog or a cat as a competitor predator. So we always recommend that pet owners make noise, talk, flick lights on and off a few times to warn wildlife, and even accompany dogs outside during seasonal coyote and deer activity, especially small dogs. And we get calls about deskunking. So some people are going to want to know ways to deskunk their dogs. And they like to call us and tell us to come and remove all of the skunks from the city because their dogs are getting sprayed so much. Shiny things that move unpredictably is sometimes very scary for wildlife. Again, good interpretive technique. People all know what furniture is. Ask someone how often they move their furniture. Most people will say not very often. Ask them if they're scared of their furniture, even walking around in the dark. Most people will say usually not, because they kind of know where everything is and they can get around pretty unscathed. It's really just not that scary. When we use scare tactics on wildlife, it has to be unpredictable to really spook them. So even things that move might need to be moved once in a while, not to be just furniture, as this scary owl is certainly now furniture for these birds. We also can make use of lion-proof lighting, special lights that are going to thwart some wildlife trouble. So lights, especially if they blink unpredictably or move in a wave motion, like the running lights that some are on a wave motion on a house or a Christmas tree, can be really effective and even lion-proof. Here, a strand of lights on the ground bordering a garden can deter deer, or a light strand on top of a fence can also deter them. So what about those lion-proof lights? Richard Terreri from Kitengela, Kenya, invented some lion-proof lighting in 2011 when he was 11 years old. He fitted a series of flashing LED bulbs onto poles around the livestock enclosures facing outward, and the lights were wired to a box with switches to an old car battery that he powered with a solar panel. They're designed to flicker on and off intermittently, so they actually trick the lions into believing that someone is walking around carrying a flashlight. This deters leopards and hyenas as well. Many residents in our areas near streams or rivers have spotted beaver. Some have even lost trees to beaver. Most folks know that beavers build dams or dens, but they may not know how the entire tree is used. And of course, beaver plant underwater forests out of the branches and sticks, which they push down into the stream bed as a food cache. An interpretive likeness that helps people understand this is everyone knows what cupboards and pantries are for storing food, and these are basically underwater pantries. So when our pantry is empty, what do? We stop by the store, we pick up more. Beavers chop down more trees and collect more brush. So to get them to move along to another place to call home, we must cut off their building material availability and their grocery supply. People don't really live in places where there are no building or food supplies, and neither do beaver. We can offer folks options to wrap trees or paint them with a sand paint mix. The city will turn off fountains for a time when we need to. Residents don't like it, but the sound of moving water is a dinner bell for beaver to come home and fix up the house. Their instinct to stop the sound of water moving is as high as our instinct or reflex to put up our hands and try to catch a ball tossed our way so it doesn't hit us. We try to send out an HOA or next door memo if we're going to turn off fountains. This can reduce a lot of calls and pushback. So a little bit of preemptive education. If beaver are the cause, we're also going to send out guidelines for tree protection, letting residents know that the city will be picking up trees that the beaver have cut down, as well as cleaning up any branches and brush so they don't have any food sources. And beaver move around a lot anyway, but we can get them to move sooner than later. Excluding bats can be done by a resident or by a company. Commercial bat cones can be purchased, or creative use of items found around the home to make a cone certainly works just as well. Like raccoons and squirrels, bats are seasonal removals in order to avoid harming pups or hibernating bats. For the do-it-yourself resident, caulking tubes are an inexpensive way to make bat exclusion tubes. They can add a pantyhose foot with the toe cut open, or a plastic or onion net sleeve to the end that allows the bats to kind of slide down the tube, get out of the entry of the sleeve, and then when they fly back, they don't really have a way to land and climb back into the entrance or crawl back up the tube. Non-native cavity nesting birds, such as starlings and sparrows, are savvy about finding pretty much any opening in a home, and they'll even use the dryer vent flaps. They can squeeze in through one of the flaps, especially if one's broken. Usually the call to us as a resident saying they hear noises in the wall and little bugs are coming out of their vent or the dryer. They're totally grossed out about it, and I'm trying just not to laugh. So dry vent covers need to be secure and also accessible for vent cleaning. Mesh baskets will keep the birds out where the flaps don't always do that, but they'll need cleaned of lint when it starts to build up. So sometimes we have to remind residents, here's a solution, but you also have to, be safe about it. Downspout cups can be placed over the openings inside the gutter. I think most people use those for leaves, but if you've got problems with birds going down into the downspout, it's a good solution. Now and then we also receive calls about true orphaned or potential orphaned animals, and both Ohio Department of Natural Resources and Ohio Wildlife Rehabilitators Association have links for, quote, find a rehabilitator near you. We can empower homeowners to make sure that an animal actually needs human interference. Of course, a lot of them don't. So some of our most important communication that we will ever do in our community is to help create understanding about the need to keep the wild and wildlife, to not kidnap animals, to prevent habituating wildlife. Um, so we can give a caller guidance on things to do, like the rabbit stick test, nest stick test, putting baby birds back into the nest if they've fallen, leaving fawns alone, and so forth. By the same account, we also need to then address actual orphans and injured wildlife and help people get them to rehab. Most folks know what a tic-tac-toe game is, and so they can take some sticks that are 12 or so inches long and place them over a rabbit nest in the shape of a tic-tac-toe board. People really think that the nests are abandoned because they don't see the moms, and this is a test. They can do this at sundown, and then they check it the next morning at sunup. And of course, if the mother rabbit's been there, she will have moved all the sticks. Or they can sprinkle flour around the nest. So they probably have flour in the kitchen, and then they can see that the flour has prints or has been disturbed as she has gone in and fed her babies. Again, we can give them some other things to do. Another common complaint is, well, you have to take the bunnies because my dog's going to get them. They can fence these areas off with mesh or openings big enough for the mother rabbit to just crawl through, or they can take a laundry basket, cover the nest during the day, and uncover it before they go to bed, and that will allow the mom, obviously, to feed the babies. Insect invaders, well, it just depends on the season and the year and the types of insects, but most insects are pretty repelled by peppermint oil. I'm always a little cautious about recommending things like this to the public because of the problems with some people being allergic. So I always recommend they check with their health provider first to make sure they can even be handling peppermint oil, and to wear gloves so they're not getting it on their skin, things like that. But diluted peppermint oil placed in on a cotton ball, and just a regular kitchen skewer works well so that you don't have to touch the cotton ball, and then you can rub this solution on window coverings or really anywhere that bugs are getting in. Clover mites. So these are one of our kind of fun calls that we get every year. A few people call about these little red bugs that are crawling around on their concrete. And they're usually kind of interested in them once we explain a little bit about them. So again, these can be repelled with things like peppermint oil, but they're really unobtrusive little bugs. They supplement their meat diet. They're predators that supplement their meat diet with pollen. And the research conducted by Wittenberg University is kind of neat about their life cycle. If your community sprays for mosquitoes, once they've identified West Nile pools, plan on preparing educational material ahead of time and have it available either on the web or social media or sent directly to the neighborhood. Sometimes we do door hangers and we do street signs a lot. People don't realize that the sprays are used at dilutions and mist droplet size and times of day that reduce non-target insect effects. And of course, spraying isn't just done willy-nilly, it's done in connection with positive pools. So we need to also then teach residents to keep on top of standing water, make sure they don't have any on their property, keep bird baths clean, and refresh water every 2 to 3 days to avoid mosquito egg laying. There are some times where people will complain about potential threat to themselves or their pets, and a lot of times we might refer these kinds of inquiries to the health department if we're not getting anywhere with the resident. Some common toys and objects can be used as deterrents to spook wildlife out of areas where we don't want them. Usually a homeowner with serious concerns ends up laughing when we give them things to try that seem silly or counterintuitive, but in the end work pretty well. Sometimes a lot of professionals will laugh at these things and say they don't really work. The thing about most of these kinds of tools is they work if we use them right, which means keeping the wildlife guessing. Change is our friend. Slinkies make good deterrents for birds trying to sit on ledges. Um, it takes a little more effort to install, but when birds insist on attacking car side mirrors, those little plastic toy slinkies that sell for about $1 at the Dollar Tree can be looped around the front and the top of the mirror and just clipped on with little tiny chip clips. This kind of prevents the bird from really seeing the mirror very well, and also deters them from being able to land on top of the mirror and then reach down and peck the reflection. So pretty simple solution and really less than a couple dollars. Toy snakes can deter birds, but again, you need to move them around. If they just sit in one place, they become furniture and the birds ignore them. Animals see pattern really well, so loud patterns and even sometimes loud colors are definitely helpful. Dangling toy spiders that move, that are hung a little bit off the building so that they move, can help deter woodpeckers. Wild Birds Unlimited actually even makes a motion detector spider on a drop release string. So if a woodpecker is coming up to a part of a house and pecking there frequently enough, when it flies by, this thing, it's a huge spider about the size of a human hand, it drops out and really pretty much shocks the bird into leaving that area. CD discs have a light flashing action, a little bit like those water bottles. And of course, the little toy weasel for dogs moves around and growls and makes noise. And that might be something to put in a garden if you have a really animal insisting on digging or eating plants. We also get some fun calls. Everybody gets those. You know, the snake sunning on the porch is a crisis. Um, the skunks are spraying, hawks are diving, and even wild pig sightings. So for birds that are dive bombing people in yards, one of the simplest solutions that seems fairly effective is to hang a few CDs in the trees where people are that the birds are attacking them. And this one picture, the people really went all out or hung a lot of CDs. I've had homeowners that just hang 3 or 4 and it seems to work pretty well. So these birds' eyes are designed to catch movement, and so these move a little bit even on a windless day. And as they're starting to dive down toward a human, apparently they either catch their reflection moving in the disc or the disc moves, and it really distracts them. They have to address it. So it kind of calls them off the people that they're trying to get after. So this was kind of a fun inquiry I had. A few years ago, an elderly gentleman called to report a wild hog had run through his backyard. So I thanked him and told him I would check it out. And my first instinct was it was just a big raccoon, since their arched back and their dark color can easily resemble a wild hog. And I mentioned to the gentleman how destructive these animals are, and we'd probably, if there was one, we would be getting a lot of complaints about entire lawns ripped up and parks torn apart and so on. Well, I had just started to work in the city, so I wasn't real familiar with all of the neighborhoods. And lo and behold, when I went to this neighborhood, immediately next to this yard is about 30 or more acres along I-270 of scrub brush habitat. And when I looked at that, I thought, wow, that would be the perfect home for a wild pig in the city. So before I mentally wrote it off that it was just a raccoon, I did look around to see if there was, signs of any wild pigs digging up the properties, and there really wasn't. So I'm sure it was just a raccoon that he saw. That was pretty fun. So at the end of the day, providing resources that residents can easily access 24/7 on their own to help get answers, solve a conflict, or get emergency help will be one of our best communication tools. For Dublin, this is in the form of an all animal reference list posted on our website, and we hand it out, and a lot of communities already have it, which connects callers to the services regarding animals, policies, and regulations from all three counties in the city. We are often the front line and liaison for our residents' impression of the community when they have animal questions and concerns. So we want to represent the cities well by engaging people positively in all aspects of our communication. I hope this session provided some ways to build our skills and ideas for framing how we communicate to our public with a goal to create understanding and foster peaceful coexistence between wildlife and humans. Thank you very much.